Welcome to episode number 17 of the Debrief podcast. I'm Josh Durso, joined by Jackie Augustine. We're here in the FingerLakes1.com studio, and we are about a week and a half, 2 weeks away. I don't know if you knew this, Jackie, from our 1 year mark doing this podcast.
No, I didn't realize that.
We've got a lot of interesting topics that we're going to be talking about today. Debate around firefighters in Canandaigua, the March for Gender Equality held last weekend in Seneca Falls, fake news in the Finger Lakes, and much, much more. But first, we finally have some actual, how do we want to put this, questions from readers.
Or listener questions.
Listener questions, which we have
viewer questions.
Really... Yeah, and we've been fighting to get these pulled up and active for a while now. This has probably been the biggest thing that our readers or listeners actually want us to do. They'd probably be happier if we just did a full hour of questions every single week.
It'd be neat if we could have them call in and we could dialogue with them.
That's doable, but the timing of it, since we record this at somewhat sporadic times, would be a little bit of a challenge. Okay, so... let me just jump over here and pull up our first question from Nancy in Penyan. Why is Representative Tom Reed so difficult to beat? Is it just plain politics? And I think what she means by that is the demographics of the region.
Right.
Maybe. What do you think? What's your feeling on that?
Well, yeah, it's certainly not because he's doing a good job. I mean, because that is not the case.
You mean he isn't?
In fact, he just released... Oh, this was going to be my miss. Well, just to preview, I guess, a little bit what my miss is going to be. He released his 2018 priorities, and you couldn't really get more tone deaf about what's actually going on in this district or in the nation or in the world right now. So, he's worried about college costs, and he keeps talking about tax reform. Maybe he didn't notice what already happened. I don't know. But why do I think he's so hard to beat? I think he is... he's got a really good network of kind of spin doctors that take whatever's happening in Washington and find ways to put it out in bits and pieces. He does a lot of what I would consider what people call like hit job mailers, where he sends out these really inflammatory pieces that terrify people into thinking the sky is falling and that he's the only one that can rescue them. So... it's difficult. He's got a lot of money. He's got a lot of backers from particularly the healthcare industry where he used to work, collecting people's medical debts and trying to bankrupt them. And that's hard to beat, and it's hard to beat in a district that leans Republican registration-wise anyway. So... that's why he's tough to beat, because he's really bought in. He's really become part of that Washington machine that just is like a tornado coming through the district, and you can't really get your footing against him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I pretty much agree with what you're saying. I mean, he does seem tone deaf to a certain percentage of his constituents, even though he does talk frequently about representing everyone. But this is, I think you sort of get into these situations where the demographics of these different districts is really complicated. And I think because of the urban-rural sort of combination, it makes it a little bit difficult to represent everyone. Because I think if you're talking about pure representation, like representing the people who make up your district, that's very different than what we typically see in terms of representation. Mm-hmm. So there, you see elected officials representing a select viewpoint or a particular, we'll call it political style or ideology, whatever the case may be. That's kind of where that falls, at least in my opinion. Now, can the tide turn? I think it can. I think, this goes back to who turns out and who actually votes.
Yes, absolutely.
Very few people turn out and actually vote in this world. So the tide can change. I certainly think it can change any time. But our next question, interestingly enough, kind of piggybacks off that idea. Okay. Paula Nithka asks, should a crowded field be worrisome for those hoping to unseat Tom Reed in 2018?
No, I don't think a crowded field is a bad thing. I mean, that shows that people are paying attention and listening and feeling energized and feel like they have something to contribute. Do I think it's a bad thing if after the normal primary cycle we end up with 10 candidates on the ballot on a variety of smaller parties? Yeah, I think that's a bad sign. But I think if this district can actually see how there are a lot of commonalities even between the rural and urban distinction that you were just talking about, there are some fundamental issues that everybody in this district cares about, and I would say I think healthcare is one of them. I think opioids is one of them. I don't know. I think the field will winnow down, and I think that's a good thing. I think it's great to have a lot of ideas going into it, and then as long as people don't bow out of if their candidate doesn't make it to the general election, as long as they don't say, oh, well, if it's not my person, then I don't want anybody. I think as long as people keep up the momentum, it's a good thing.
So I'm kind of split on this. I understand what you're saying, but I do think that when people start to pay attention to any sort of political race, I feel like most of the time their mind has already been made up. That's why I always think you want to maximize the time that you have fighting a legitimate contest.
Right.
In this case, I believe the Democrats have 7 potential nominees right now for his district. That to me, they're holding a forum this weekend in Seneca Falls, Sunday from 2 to 4 p.m. It's really interesting because I think you need as much time as you possibly can to maximize the candidate's exposure, like the selected candidate of the party. Now that is not to say that the party shouldn't go through a very definitive and slow process to come to the right person.
Right.
But at the same time, when you're talking about a district that's been dominated by Reed for so long, you really need every second, every minute really does matter and count.
Yeah, sure, I can see that.
So then, jumping down, this is actually more of a state question, but I thought it was really interesting. Alex in Macedon asked, will the chambers find enough revenue to offset New York State budget shortfall, that giant $4 billion shortfall? That facial expression does not look like one that exudes confidence.
No. Yes, that is the $4 billion question, right? I don't know. I don't know what they're going to do because some of the programs that actually seem to be working well might end up being the programs that are on the chopping block, and then there are other things that don't seem to be working well but have real champions who have a lot of political clout, so those things might stay. And I don't know. If I could solve the state's budget problems, I think, I don't know. I guess I would just say
you might be the most
above
celebrated person in New York State.
I don't know what they're going to do, especially now. I mean, there's, a commitment to continue providing health care to the dreamers, right? To people who are caught up in the national debate over immigration right now, people who came here as kids, who've been here their whole lives. And all of the polls, if you just talk to people on the street, most reasonable people say, yes. I mean, people have been here. You can't just strip everything away from them. Mm-hmm. And New York State has just come out saying that they won't do that. They will not let those benefits and those rights be stripped from people. But that's a political football. Everything becomes a political football when there's not enough money to go around. So I don't know. I'm keeping my eye on that because I'm not sure how they're going to get themselves out of that.
So I think of the process of creating the budget and creating your spending goals before you actually have a solid idea of what the money coming in is going to be, and it just doesn't really seem like New York State has been able to create the right balance for a while now.
Yeah.
And making yearly guarantees on, select programs or this, that, or the other thing. I almost wonder if New York State would be better off kind of creating multi-year spending plans.
Yes, everyone
instead
would be.
Instead of doing this year to year kind of, dodge, it just might simplify the process a little bit, and it might create a little better result when all is said and done.
Well, it's interesting that you say that because, several years ago, I remember that the state imposed this requirement on cities across the state that in order to keep receiving their state aid, they had to adopt a multi-year budget. And it had to be a good faith approximation of what your fiscal picture really looked like. And it's interesting to me. I mean, I agree. I think that's good practice, but the state, exempts itself from the things that it wants its own jurisdictions and municipalities to do. So I think it should, what's good for the goose, good for the gander. They should have to do the same thing.
Yeah, and that sort of ties into the whole, which is completely off topic, but the whole tying aid or reimbursement to particular programs that the state implements, regardless of what anybody below that level of the food chain thinks, feels, or otherwise.
Right.
And that's definitely part of the larger financial problem in the state. But anyway, those were our 3 questions for the day.
Yes, sorry, Alex and Macedon, we don't know how to fix the budget, but we'll keep talking about it.
Yeah, I mean, and of course, if you want to send your questions in, drop us a like on Facebook, send the questions there, or you can find us on Facebook, Finger Lakes 1 also. Drop the questions there too. We'll be combing. I'll be combing. We'll be looking and listening. So let's jump into our first real topic of the day. Last week, obviously, Jackie, I'm sure you heard, over or right around 15,000 people showed up on January 20th for the second annual Women March in Seneca Falls. Protesters marched for literally dozens of reasons, but some folks out there honed in on those marching or protesting President Donald Trump. I personally spoke with a lot of people who were there for a ton of other reasons. But I guess my frustration after living through it and then seeing some of the reaction, a lot of the reaction on social media, it's really frustrating to see people hone in on the things that frustrate them the most instead of looking at the big picture and all of the different topics and all the different reasons that people were there last weekend. Your thoughts?
Right. Well, in general, I think that the idea of having a march is really about giving people an opportunity to look around and see the magnitude of people who agree with them on a variety of things, that are feeling discontented, that think things are wrong, and then trying to find a way to translate that into some kind of action. So, I had asked, and then I heard back that, several of the marches around the country were doing voter registration drives at the same time. That, there are also programs now to help get more women into office and to get candidates who resonate with some of the issues that are being raised at the marches, to try to get them more involved in local government and beyond, state government, House of Representatives. And I think that's good, because sometimes what I've found is that people might be reluctant to express their discontent or disagreement with policies if they feel like they're the only ones. That hasn't really been my problem. For whatever reason, I have not really, I've just always been like, well, this is what I think and it is what it is, right? And if I'm the only one, that's okay. But I do think that it's helpful to show people and encourage people and strengthen the idea that they're not alone, that lots of people have these questions and concerns and priorities, and they're not being addressed, and something needs to change. So, yeah, I think, I'm not sure I answered your question, but that's my take on it.
Yeah, and sort of getting back to the, equal pay, better representation in government, business, and the community in general were a lot of the sort of backbone of what I was hearing when, looking past the Donald Trump signs and things like that.
Right.
And I think that's kind of the important thing, is that we not lose sight of those issues. Obviously, at any event like that, when you have 10 to 15,000 people in one place, you're going to have a contingency of that group that is dead set on one particular, keyed in on one particular controversial issue. But at the same time, you're going to have literally hundreds others who are there for other important reasons. And
Right.
you don't want to lose sight of the ones that, don't get quite as many headlines, don't get quite as much interest. The equal pay, to me, the biggest, most glaring and seemingly the easiest thing in the world to fix is the pay differential between men and women in the workforce across the board. Obviously, representation in government is something that we've talked about before. Right. I'm not really sure how you directly affect that when, our government as a whole functions kind of isolated by itself, because there isn't a lot of, there's not a lot of involvement from anyone, men,
Right.
women, or otherwise. So I just think, take away from an event like this, see where the common ground is, see where we can actually make some progress, and try to really focus on those areas and not the ones that people are just yelling and screaming about.
Yeah. I mean, I think the common area of focus really amongst all the issues that get raised are that people want things to be fair, people want things to be just, people want people to treat each other with respect, decency, and dignity. And I think that's what motivated a lot of people to march, is that speaking like as a mom, when you see leaders doing things that any good mom tells their kids not to do, and hopefully any good dad tells their kids not to do, you've got to stand up against that, because your kids will they'll see what you stand for or what you tolerate. So what's been going on recently, we can't tolerate.
Absolutely. I agree with that. It's just, and I see a situation like this. And last year there were similar marches. I think more of them last year across the whole country. There were still several across the country this year. But I hope it translates to something more.
Yes,
because there were a lot of people who sat back and viewed this and said, well, what's it going to do? Well, if there isn't the next several steps of progress in there, where there is, actual legislation and actual sort of boots on the ground, so to speak, beyond the protest, it unfortunately will somewhat fall flat. And that's the disappointing part, I think, for me.
Yeah.
Let's switch gears, though. We got right through that one. This one was really interesting to me because I feel like a problem that every community is dealing with. So union officials with the Canandaigua Fire Department are asking for better staffing as the city continues to grapple with paid and volunteer firefighters on staff. City Manager John Goodwin and Mayor Ellen Palomeni say budgeting is difficult, and the loss of paid firefighters, which happened about 7 to 10 years ago, is the biggest issue that they've been trying to correct. Union reps say, though, they really only need one more paid firefighter, but that seems to run in conflict with the direction that the city wants to go. The city wants to hire an assistant chief who would be able to fight fires, fill a needed administrative role, and bolster volunteer numbers. Now, it took me all of 30 seconds to do a quick Google search on what the volunteer firefighter numbers look like and how they've been evolving over the last 20 to 30 years. And I have family members who were and are volunteer firefighters, and the numbers are dwindling. And that isn't a secret. That isn't a trend that's exclusive to Canandaigua. That's not something that's exclusive to any community. It's happening. So the reason why I wanted to talk about it was how, when you see a situation like that, where literally all they're asking for is one paid ordinary firefighter to fill out a schedule so that the annual schedule can be filled, thus solving a problem that now has been bubbling just beneath the surface for over, I think we're approaching a year, because the Nolan's fire, Nolan's on the lake, when that building caught fire, business shut down, that was what sort of started this whole thing.
And, I mean, their fire chief was fired. So I think that threw things into some turmoil also. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, that situation is interesting to me to look at, because Geneva has always enjoyed a really healthy core of volunteer firefighters, and well aware that they are good and committed people, because I've faced several rooms full of them about things they disagree with me about. So, but politics aside, that every time, this might sound silly, every time there's a parade, the Geneva contingent is well represented, mm-hmm. So it's not really an issue that specific, right? We've had talks about the fire horn, we've had talks about scheduling, we've had talks about introducing different policies into the contracts, but not having volunteers was not really the most pressing issue. Mm-hmm. So to hear that Canandaigua is having trouble getting people to volunteer, I feel like they should come over and ask Geneva what they're doing, because what they're doing has been working to get the numbers. So yeah, I don't know what the answer is for Canandaigua. I'm surprised that it's even an open question, because in Geneva there were minimum staffing requirements as part of the contract. So it wasn't really an option for the city to tinker with those numbers. Whereas it sounds
Does Geneva have a mixture of paid and volunteer, or is it just straight volunteer?
Yeah. No, they're paid. They're the fire drivers, so they're the paid firefighters. And then the volunteers are the people on the scene. I mean, the paid guys are on the scene too, driving the equipment, and then the volunteers are there. So it's hard for me to understand how Canandaigua's system works or what's going wrong with it. But yeah, I don't know.
See, to me, it's just one of those things where it's of all the things that the city, any municipality of, whether it's Geneva, Canandaigua, Auburn, when you look at communities that size, they're on the cusp. They aren't so large that they definitely need paid staff, and they aren't so small that they can rely solely on volunteers. So it's almost to me, it seems unfortunately, and especially judging from what the community seems to think about this, at least on the surface, from what we've been able to find and see scattered across the different parts of social media and the internet and such, it seems that the city would be of the mind to just take the temporary hit of hiring, and maybe even being a little overstaffed on the paid firefighter side, at least while finding volunteers is an issue.
Right.
Maybe down the road, when volunteers become less of an issue, you reevaluate it, you scale that back a little bit, and so forth and so on. But to have it be a very black and white, cut and dry decision, it has to be this way or it has to be this way, there's no in between, just seems like a really tough way to do business, because you're gonna frustrate somebody. And I also wonder, so now that this debate has become so public, and you have union representation out there on the ground, on the streets, and you've got City Hall with a different mind, then what kind of confidence does that give the residents, the taxpayers, that God forbid something happens at their home, that firefighters, first responders are going to be able to get there in time and save their property, potentially save lives? Right. It's tough. Yeah. It's a weird place to, you know what I mean? It's a weird place to be in.
Right.
So I know this is something you've wanted to talk about. There were two really interesting, well-reported stories. Earlier today, I had Peter Mantius of the Waterfront Online blog, in studio. We had about a 30-minute talk about the two stories that he published in the last roughly about 10 days.
Yeah.
One came out at the beginning of this week. One just came out yesterday. He's been knocking off some really impressive investigative reporting, and that's something you and I have talked a lot about, that this region needs more of.
Absolutely.
But just your thoughts on those two stories. One of them involved radioactive leachate, and the other involved the process, basically the 9-month span before the incinerator proposal from Circular Energy became public in Romulus.
Right. Right. Well, I guess we'll start with the glowing sewers, the radioactive leachate first. So, yeah, I mean, Peter is, he is an investigative journalist. Sometimes I think people say, oh, there's something posted on a blog. Like, no, he is a professional journalist who has been doing excellent work.
He's got decades.
Yeah.
That man has decades of experience.
That is his job. That's his career. And he has done some really excellent work for us, for the Finger Lakes, right? And he reported on this court hearing about the leachate composition of landfills that are taking hydrofracking drilling waste. Now, in this area, I am not sure about the other municipalities, but Geneva passed a resolution that we would not accept leachate from, I should say they, not we, not on city council. Anyway, that they shouldn't accept, it's my city, that
it's the city you call home.
That's right. I still care about it. So anyway, that leachate wouldn't be accepted at the wastewater treatment plant if there were any byproducts of hydrofracking that were accepted. And that was for two reasons. A, because the concern was that that would be support for hydrofracking, which we were not supportive of. But second, and probably more important priority, was the health concern. So now, through this testimony that's been given and these experts that have testified, turns out the worries bore out. It's true. Radium and radon, with specific numbers that I can't remember, have been decomposing, and that is leading to radioactive leachate being discharged. Now, the wastewater treatment plants in this area are not radioactive waste disposal facilities. That should come as no surprise to people. So the question now is, since Seneca Meadows is on this list, is anyone going to do anything about it? Are people okay with this or not? Well, I'm not okay with it.
As I understand it, from what Peter told me this morning, Seneca Meadows is not presently. Seneca Meadows did for a period, but is no longer accepting any of that material. I haven't seen any of the documentation or numbers, but my own guess would be that they are not accepting any of it presently. Now, does that mean that it hasn't already been there or wasn't there for a long enough period for it to cause some sort of local or regional harm? It's possible.
But, that's the question, right? It's not really... The present question is not what's coming into the landfill right now. The present question is what's in the landfill and what's percolating out of it, because leachate is a byproduct of the decomposition of what's in the landfill. So it's well and good if Seneca Meadows has adopted a policy to no longer take hydrofracking waste. I think that's sensible, and people should ask to see that in writing, and there should be some confirmation of that. But the question raised by this reporting is what is already in there and where is that leachate going and which water source is it ending up in, because the final destination for leachate is some water discharge point, whether it's Seneca Lake, whether it's the canal that continues to drain north. The treated leachate goes somewhere.
So I guess my personal issue with all of this is really, once again, we see another example of the DEC needing to step up their game a little bit in terms of, this should be well protected, well managed, documented, the whole 9 yards. And it kind of seems like, judging from this reporting, that it caught a lot of people off guard. It caught a lot of people by surprise. And I think we always, a lot of times we'll get into these discussions about what's good policy versus bad policy. Not publicizing that type of information, making that information sort of readily available at the surface, not having to rely on deep investigative, weeks-long reporting, FOIL requests and everything like that. That's really important, I think. And that's the real, my other frustration, it's always evolving. What is or is not being tested for is always evolving at these facilities. And that's not on, in my opinion, that's not on the facility. That's not the facility's problem. That's a DEC problem, because they are the entity that's supposed to oversee all of this. And if they cannot properly, that's effectively saying they can't properly manage all of what's happening in New York State.
I agree with you that you can't fault a business for not complying with a regulation that doesn't exist. I agree with you. However, if I am to take anything that waste management people, and I don't mean waste management, the business, I'm saying people in the waste management industry. If we're to take anything they say seriously, then we should take seriously the claim that they are the experts in waste management. Mm-hmm. So I do believe some responsibility falls on the operators of the landfill to know what they're taking in and to know what that might decompose into, what that might release, how that's going to work through the system, what that's going to mean for people who are on the downstream end of that. And I understand that when driven by profit, you might not want to raise your hand and say, guess what, we're going to be taking this stuff that you probably want to regulate because it's bad for human health, so could you do that and put more regulations on us? Unfortunately, that is not the way business works in our world, sadly. But it would be nice at some point if we could get out in front of this, and if the DEC could in some way have their ear a little bit more to the ground in some of these industries that have high potential for affecting human health, and start to anticipate or listen to the many researchers and scientists who say, be aware of this and be aware of that, because people were talking about potentially radioactive waste from hydrofracking way back before there was any hydrofracking waste to be taken. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, the DEC, frankly, I think is understaffed. I don't think they have a group that is the forward tip of the spear group that's trying to figure out what's coming next. I think they're always playing catch up with what's already existing.
So I take that one part of what you said and I kind of flip it and say, well, yes, these businesses claim to be the experts in waste management and all of that, but the DEC has to be the leader, the experts.
Right. Agreed.
Like, you can't have any sort of back and forth where there's any sort of uncertainty or hesitation or anything like that. It has to just be fact.
Right.
You know what I mean? So the DEC really does need to take the lead and be out in front.
Yeah.
And be the true experts, the unargued experts on these topics. And sort of I almost wonder, you talk about understaffing, you talk about underfunding. I wonder how much experimental testing is happening to sort of make these sort of evolutions happen.
Yeah,
what kind of studies are being done to determine what the next big environmental issue is going to be within the landfilling or the whatever, whether it's renewable energy projects or whatever the case may be.
Right.
How in front are they ever?
Yeah.
Or is it a process where someone, a corporate entity, a business, ultimately kind of tells on the rest of the industry, and that leads to systematic change?
I think it's the latter, unfortunately, and I wish that were not the case. But again, I guess just to not totally hammer on the DEC, I think that they would probably argue that they don't have the money to be looking ahead because they have to spend their money on looking at what's currently here and what they already know and what they can enforce. Because, I mean, there's plenty of environmental violation to be found in the practices that we all know about. So to add a layer about trying to figure out the things we don't yet know, yeah, that's an additional investment.
Okay, so story number 2.
From Peter, yes.
From Peter, actually involved the incinerator.
Oh, my goodness. And for me, the story, like, we all suspected that the attorney wrote the memo and that maybe the zoning officer didn't even sign it. I mean, so, that's its own way out of line issue, right? But I think there were many of us who already suspected that had happened. So getting confirmation of that is great. But for me, the real story here is that FOIL requests are important, that people's right to information has to be completely protected, and we need to understand that people who stand to make lots of money from projects are not the most reliable sources of their own information. So going out and double checking and checking the record is really important. So for me, the story is like, this region needs more of this, more investigative journalism, more foiling, more keeping people honest. Well, I can't even say it's keeping people honest. It's more exposing dishonesty. This isn't an issue where they proved that someone told the truth. It's actually an issue proving that someone misrepresented. So it's important. And if people ever ask, oh, what can I do? How can I, change things in the area? Pay attention. Do what this woman from Romulus did, which is
Marianne Kowalski.
Yeah, like go down and say, I'd like to actually see the correspondence that led up to this letter being issued. And man, I mean, can I read just one piece of it?
By all means.
Is that okay? Let me
While you're pulling that up,
Okay.
I'm just going to sort of jump in with my thoughts, my general thoughts on it. After having a lengthy discussion with Peter this morning, I don't really, it's amazing that all of that could happen without anybody even in the public eye knowing that it was happening. And, you get into this discussion about, yes, it's a news thing. Yes, in a perfect world, news organizations are able to do this type of thing. But, what you learn from listening to Peter talk and also reading his reporting, he's spending weeks and weeks and weeks on single stories.
Right.
We have been removed in the news business from that model, that methodology for probably a decade and a half, honestly. With the rise of computers, it's now, there's a 24-hour news cycle, and more appropriately, the news cycle that only lasts as far as you swipe in on your Facebook or Twitter timeline. It's just really, really complicated. It's tough. It's hard to do business in the modern culture. But that said, thank God for people like Peter who not only do it, and in his case, he's doing it for nothing. He has no sponsors. He has no allegiance to anyone or anything. He's just literally out there trying to get answers. But just in general, it's good to see that heart there, that effort.
Yep.
Go on.
No, it's great. I mean, this for me is a gem worthy of framing. This is the email from the attorney for the project, Alan Knopf, and he's sending it to Pat Morrell and copying in the other attorney. Pat, as we discussed today, here's the proposed interpretation my client, Mike Palumbo, would like to get from the town. I'm copying Jared Lusk, who represents Earl Martin. And attached to that is the document which ends up being the letter that the zoning officer says he was asked to sign but doesn't remember signing, and then is emailed a signed copy. You don't have to email somebody a signed copy when they're the ones who signed it. They should be emailing it to you. And I mean, frankly, if I were these guys, I would never show my face around here again. Like, that's a big lie to be caught in. But they'll be back. Mark my words, they'll be back.
Well, and now the cherry on top of this entire Sunday is that, it's no longer a local decision.
Right.
So, I mean, that's and that was part of the latter half of our discussion when Peter was here, is just sort of, this is a process that could take years. This is a process that minimally probably won't be resolved until late this year or early next year. So this is one of those scenarios where it becomes a test of the will of the local people. How long are they able to continue? I don't want to say putting up the fight that they've put up, because, I think those who live in the Finger Lakes, their voice has been well represented as far as that goes. Even most elected officials are completely against this project in Seneca County. Ontario County, I believe, County also too. Same way.
Board of Supervisors and Town and City of Geneva have all passed resolutions against it.
Yeah, so I mean, it just becomes kind of like there needs to be, can't forget about it, is what it comes down to, because 6-7 months from now it'll be in the back of everyone's mind, and that's when sometimes you'll see something slip and slide through behind the scenes. You don't want that kind of situation to play out.
No, people have to be vigilant, persistent.
Okay. So let's talk about something. This is our last topic for the day.
Okay.
And this is the one that's been stressing me out the most over the last 2 weeks.
I feel badly for you.
So 2 weekends ago, I wrote a column outlining some of my thoughts and some thoughts that were also shared with me by business owners and stakeholders in Seneca Falls about an existing policy on snow removal in the downtown corridor. The column prompted me to ask a simple question to town officials. As the policy of downtown snow removal, so in the 2 business districts, was either ineffective or poorly enforced, it took business owners in the town days to get the snow cleared from that one storm that we had that it was maybe like around a foot of snow. Not something that's completely unheard of in upstate New York. I mean, snow. We get snow. Especially, we get trains too.
Always at this time. We should adjust our time.
Yeah. So I reached out to town officials for comment and explanation on the policy, which drew a wide reaction. Deputy Supervisor Lou Ferraro said that the policy needs improvement and that he was going to focus on actually trying to change the policy, or at least ensure that there's better enforcement of the policy. Dave DeLaylis, councilman, gave me a brief overview of what the policy was, and then Supervisor Greg Lazaro told me to contact the Highway Superintendent Jim Peterson, but he didn't stop there. He further told me to print the news, not make it, in an emailed statement. Those were his words, not mine. I tweeted out the screenshot of the email, and I also printed the statement in full within the story. So there's like 3 different parts of that that need talking, that deserve like a conversation. One, this sort of fallback option of elected officials to scapegoat news organizations for pointing out issues that are clearly issues. I just want to quickly jump and just show people what we're talking about here. That is not a made-up issue.
Right.
That's downtown Seneca Falls after a snowstorm, more than 24 hours removed. That's snow. That's not a pretend issue. That's real. Now, in their defense, I have since talked to Supervisor Lazaro. I have talked to Highway Superintendent Jim Peterson, and everyone seems on the same page now as far as, something needs to change, or if nothing's going to change, the current policy needs to be enforced thoroughly. The town did publish on their website, and they shot it out to all of local news organizations what that policy is. So the policy says that snow has to be removed or pushed to the curb area, so essentially around where the trees are in that picture, by 9 a.m. after deposit, or after it snows. Right. At that point, the town, the highway department can come in, collect that snow, carry it away, all better. Oh, right? Like, that's what I was literally just like, it was such an easy,
Sure.
Email the policy, it's in the town code, or tell me to look it up in the town code. It really is frustrating to see elected officials default to, name calling or blaming of the news media. It's very, very frustrating. Now, that said, editorials, columns, letters to the editor, investigative stories, general news reports, press releases, these are all things that are a part of news coverage, period. There is so no matter how much you disagree with a particular viewpoint or how inconvenient it might be, this country was founded on the very idea that we would have an open and honest media system, and that there would not be any sort of discrimination against certain viewpoints or certain ideas. That part of the reason why I even published the photos with it was to actually showcase what I was talking about, so that it wasn't just my word or some other folks' words. Right. Being thrown out.
You don't have to defend it, Josh. You didn't do anything wrong. I mean, that is the way you write a story, right? This is the issue. Here's a picture of the issue. Here's how we tried to find out what's being done about the issue, and you got a snarky. And I will say response.
This: a lot of people, thought that we were throwing, or that I was throwing heat directly at our highway department. It's not the highway department's fault that the policy is what it is. That's a policy issue. That is why I reached out to the policymakers in Seneca Falls to not only identify, but give me their thoughts maybe on what could change within that policy. It's disappointing, but at the same time, don't regret it. Glad we went down that road. Glad we did what we did, because it's necessary. And I think people in Seneca Falls, especially after just absorbing a near tripling of property taxes, deserve a little more than what they're getting, even if that means something as symbolic and simple as cleaning out what becomes about probably a half mile of sidewalk space. Definitely something that should be looked at. Your thoughts from the outside. I want an outsider's view on this. Because as I understand it, I have been told over and over again that Geneva, the city of Geneva, has the same policy. I have not confirmed.
Let me tell you, I've had many a discussion, and I'm sure a couple of people watching or listening to this will be happy to vouch for the fact that there's been many a heated discussion about snow removal in Geneva. That being said, I have always accepted and believe you are 100% right that a snow removal policy is a policy. So it is the kind of conversation you have with an elected official. It's not the conversation you have with the snowplow driver. It's not the, it is the snowplow driver does enforces or enacts the policy. Mm-hmm. If you don't like it, you've got to talk to the people who made the policy. So I think from that perspective, you were totally right to call elected officials. That's their job. That is their job, to determine how things should be done. Not to do it. Like, you weren't calling Supervisor Lazaro and saying, how come you're not out there with your shovel? I mean, that was not the question. So I think that in general, this is a very alarming trend. I don't think it's new, but I think it's accelerating the rate at which elected officials' responses to a question are attack. Mm-hmm. Instead of saying, oh, person that is representing the people I work for, because that's what the news does. The news works for the public. So if a news organization, if a journalist has a question, they are asking that question on behalf of the public who has a right to know. So when you call and say, I have a question about this policy, the response should be, oh man, is this not clear? Like, are we missing something? Let me get you the information that you need so we can get that out to the community. And if something needs to change, we can change it. Like, I appreciate the input. I never have understood the response that is, why do you want to know? Or what business is that of yours? Or why don't you focus on something else? Like, this is how government runs. It's supposed to be of the people, by the people, for the people, right? Like, the news organizations represent the people better than elected officials do most of the time, frankly, as far as figuring out what actually needs to be addressed.
Mm-hmm. Now, I think the issue in Seneca Falls is complicated a little bit in a town setting because that highway superintendent is an elected official himself.
Right.
And I think a lot of people, this is kind of why we get into that philosophical debate right around election time every year. What's the difference between a Democrat and a Republican as far as execution of the duties of highway superintendent?
Oh,
should be none, right? Like, should be none.
Yes.
But you literally get into this scenario where there is people, when this story was pushed out,
mm-hmm.
people honed in on that. People honed in on, well, they made the wrong decision. That is not where this policy does not lie with this individual. This individual has absolutely nothing to do with the policy beyond the execution of, what's outlined in the policy. And the policy is so vague in Seneca Falls currently that it requires cooperation from the zoning officer, the highway department, and effectively elected officials as well. So it's not to me, and maybe this is just me being a little bit naive when it comes to creation of good, effective policy. I don't think it would take that much energy to come up with something that works a little better, something that's a little, or at the very least, the town needs to take a hard look in the mirror and take a look at the enforcement side of it.
Right.
How are these things being enforced? Are they being enforced effectively? Obviously, in Seneca Falls, they aren't. And if the enforcement, the argument has been made to me that enforcement lags because a snowstorm happens on Saturday. The policy calls for the zoning officer to call a contractor who has the right equipment to come in and take the snow out away from the building so that the highway department can do something with it. Okay, well, if you're relying on a business or a private entity that's potentially closed or not operating or not able to field your request immediately in a downtown corridor, you're putting yourself in a really difficult position. So maybe the answer is annually contracting with a business or a snow removal company to ensure that in these situations it's fixed, that it's taken care of.
Yeah, I feel like the amount of time that you spent working through that was not that long, and was a good example of how that kind of process could have played out. In general, in government, which is the thing I think we all hope will change, is that there seems to be a real effort to perpetually do things incorrectly, to avoid just sitting down and working through it. They said, well, that'll slow things down, that disrupts progress, that does this. But the amount of time spent trying to clean up the messes that are caused by just not doing it right the first time. I mean, again, I go back. I mean, like, these are lessons we teach our kids, right? Like, just do it right the first time so you don't have to keep cleaning it up later. And I'm not sure government's gotten that message. One of the many basic messages. I don't know. Sorry, I feel like I've been very negative today. I don't mean to be.
I don't think so. It's a negative world we're living in right
It's
now.
not, well, I mean, I want to be optimistic and say by pointing out the things that are going wrong.
Well, here's your chance to right the ship.
That's how we mobilize people. Right?
Hits and misses.
Okay.
You'll have a chance to talk about something good.
Yes, good.
So mine are quick, mine are easy. My hit, go take a look at my not my last, but my Inside the FLX interview with Newark Mayor Jonathan Taylor. He shared some of the things that are going on in the village. $23 million sewer upgrade that was finished late last year, major reconstruction and infrastructure project on South Main Street, a lot of grants coming into the village, and a lot of effort to connect the downtown to the canal. All of the things that you see in bits and pieces in the rest of the region happening seems to have all ships going forward in the right direction in Newark. So kudos to them. Give a listen to that podcast. It's really, really, really interesting. And then my miss is the disappointment that I have in the fact that, I think this is a news journalist reporting issue. I think we're past the days of being able to call and get statements from elected officials. Unfortunately, if using the snow removal issue in Seneca Falls as an example, if Supervisor Lazaro, and this was something that I thought about afterwards, if Supervisor Lazaro had said that to me over the phone and he had not emailed that to me, I could have run it, but at the same time, it wouldn't have had the same credibility as being able to take an entire printed, definitively recorded statement and putting it out there like that. I think we need to do better at protecting the people who are reporting and going out there to get facts and information for people, for those who need it badly.
Definitely. Yeah.
Go ahead. Give me some good news.
Well, I like to start with the miss, I think, because then we end on a positive note.
Okay,
so,
I'm down with that.
Okay, so my miss, which I already did talk about, but Congressman Reed released his 2018 priorities, and again, he's having all of these forums, and he keeps saying, and he keeps going on television saying, "I'm listening. I'm doing more listening than any other person ever elected in the universe," or whatever. That doesn't say exactly that,
Very
but that's the
grand
message
statement,
right? And his 2018 priorities show he hasn't been listening to any of it. And if you watch the actual videos of his town hall meetings, you would be hard-pressed to find the issues being raised reflected in his platform, or the issues in his platform being raised at those meetings. So I wonder, well, then who is setting his agenda if it's not us? So that's an issue. I feel like the people in the 23rd District have no representative because no voices are being heard. But my hit is that regardless of what your party affiliation is, these efforts to do these public forums with the candidates who are interested in the seat are excellent. I mean, the one at the Smith Opera House on Tuesday night was incredibly well attended and well run and well moderated, and that is giving people a direct opportunity. It's like a mini town hall meeting before a person's even elected to communicate, this is what's on our mind, here's what's important. And then it's going to give this entire district the opportunity to pick someone that they think hears them and can carry that message forward effectively. And I say more of that, whether it's during a campaign or once elected, more discussion with actual people and more policy making that reflects actual people's needs. Yeah. And enough of this money and influence and all this corrupting nonsense.
All right then.
So that's my positive note. Power to the people.
We could use more of that in this system. All right. Well, that's going to do it for us today. We'll be back in a couple weeks. Thanks to our listeners and FingerLakes1.com for making this podcast possible. Let us know what's on your mind. We'd love to hear from you and answer your questions on the next episode. To do that, head over to Facebook, throw a like on our page, and drop us a comment or message. Until next time, stay informed, Finger Lakes, and we'll catch you on the next episode of the Debrief podcast.